Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. So this video is number 6 in the ramp series. It will be all about using auras to ramp. There are a couple of things that I do want to establish right out of the gate. There are several auras that you can attach it to a land and then the land will just tap for any color of mana. It does not give you additional mana, it just fixes it. I didn't include any of those in this video because it's not ramp, it's just color fixing. Also, I don't think that they're particularly good or pointful, almost ever. There are other ways to fix your color just by getting out more lands of different colors. Some of these ones that will show up in today's video will allow you to add any color of your choice in addition to whatever color that the land naturally produces. So those ones I don't think are very practical probably ever, and also they don't literally ramp you. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that these are things that they're not as good as the doublers because these will only apply to a single land, whatever land that they happen to be attached to, but they also don't generate nearly as much attention. So while if someone was to strip mine a single land, if that land happened to have an aura attached to it, it would be a bigger blow. Them looking for a targeted removal against an enchantment, they are more likely to want to target the doubler, whereas if you just had one of these auras attached to a land, they're probably going to just not even look at it and want to destroy any other enchantment that might be on board. I know obviously Rhystic Study would be a very obvious priority target, but a real mana doubler such as Zendikar Resurgent or Mana Reflection, those might actually be on the same par as like a Rhystic Study or something else, where your opponents might seriously consider getting rid of that just as much as the other cards that your other opponents have. These auras are far less likely to be targeted. So there is that advantage of being a little bit more likely to stick around because they are less effective. Also, some of that, they do tend to be a little bit lower on the curve. So if you are looking for that turn 1 ramp play, as opposed to like a turn 4 or 5 or 6 ramp play, this is obviously very useful for that purpose. But you'd primarily only want auras in either an enchantment deck, which, with enchantresses, every time you play an enchantment, you're drawing cards. For every enchantment you control, like what's that white one where your opponents have to pay X mana for each creature attacking you, where X is the number of enchantments you control. This would help add to that X value. Obviously, Estrid, not only is that a commander that cares about enchantments, but I believe it's her plus ability, untaps all enchanted permanents. So you want creatures with auras so that they untap. You want lands with auras so that they untap. So enchantment-based decks, and then also anything with heavy tap shenanigans. Now, mana doublers will also help with that, and those will help any of your lands. But if you are, again, looking to ramp a little bit faster and you just want one or, those untapper effects, which we'll get to in the next video. Number 7 is all about untapping lands specifically. If you're doing a untap shenanigan deck, then all you're going to be doing for the most part is untapping like 1 or 2 specific lands. Most creatures that do that only untap 1 or 2. So if only 1 or 2 of them tap for extra mana, it's fine. So with all that kind of gotten out of the way, let's start with the first one. This one doesn't really follow the same pattern as all the others. It's Elvish Guidance, 3 mana, including a single green, enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds a green for each elf in play. So if you're playing any kind of elf deck, this should be an auto-include always. Unless you have a rule that says you're not allowed non-creature spells for some reason, or like you've put that rule on yourself, this should go in your elf deck. There's no reason not to run it. It's just too good. It's basically like a Priest of Titania, and it is worth pointing out that it'll give you mana for each elf in play, which means that it includes any elves that your opponents might have. But the difference between this and like a Priest of Titania or the Wildwood Channelers, Those are creatures, so they will be affected by summoning sickness. If you get this out, turn 5, 6, whatever, you attach it to an untapped land, and that land is already going to get the benefit from this right out of the gate. Also, because it's not a creature, if there's ever a board wipe, this will still stick around. It won't add anything while your board is cleared, but as soon as you start rebuilding, like you use your other lands to get just an elf or two, then the land that this is attached to now adds at 1 or 2 extra mana. So it helps you to rebuild even faster, and you don't lose it from those board wipes. And it is worth pointing out that unlike like Priest of Titania, if you have like 7 elves in play that'll tap for 7 mana, this would mean that the land, we'll just assume it's a basic forest, will tap for 1, and then this will add the 7 extra. So it's actually kind of, it's equivalent to a Priest of Titania or Wirewood Channelers, but the land still taps for its own mana on top of this. So this one should definitely be in any elf deck. There's just really not a whole lot of reason not to include it. So next we're going to go to the 1-drops that will give you a mana, and there's 2 of them, Utopia, Sprawl, and Wildgrowth. Utopia Sprawl is like 10 times as expensive as Wildgrowth, which is pretty unfortunate, but it is an uncommon, and I think it was only printed in a few sets, not very much. Wildgrowth, on the other hand, went from Alpha all the way to 6th or 7th edition, plus Ice Age, plus more reprints later in Magic's history. It's been in numerous sets. The main difference is Wildgrowth will add a green mana specifically, and can go on any land. Utopia Sprawl has to enchant a forest specifically, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose a color, and then it'll add 1 color that you chose. So if you're playing like a 4 or 5 color deck, you do have to choose right out of the gate which extra color Utopia Sprawl will give you, but you can choose any color. So it does give you more options in a multicolored deck, and that's why it sees as much play as it does. Also, because they're both 1-drops, you can get them out on turn 1, so they do offer you that fast ramp, as opposed to something like a Cultivator, Kadama's Reach, or something where you're not doing anything till turn 3. One thing I do want to point out with Wildgrowth, the bottom left corner of it, that is the 5th edition. This happened in both 5th edition and 6th edition. In the earlier versions, it says, like you can see in the top left hand of the Wildgrowth, Wildgrowth adds 1 green to your mana pool each time target land is tapped for mana. Same was true in the Ice Age one. Wildgrowth adds green to your mana whenever target land is tapped for mana. In the 5th and 6th edition one, the text was changed to say, whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, it produces an additional green, which makes it sound like the land is producing 2 mana, a green and then whatever else it does naturally. That is not the actual text. The other version where the Wildgrowth produces the mana is the correct rules interaction. And why this is important is for how they interact with things like Mana Reflection, Nyxbloom Ancient, and also I can't think of it now. I was thinking of it earlier. Anyway, yeah, so because it's the enchantment that is producing the extra mana, that won't be doubled from effects like Mana Reflection and Nyxbloom Ancient. Oh, Dampening Sphere. Dampening Sphere, which is an artifact that says, if a land is tapped for 2 or more mana, instead it produces a colorless. If the land produced 2 green, then it would have the replacement effect where it instead produces a colorless. So because that's not the case, Wildgrowth is protected, and it will the land will produce whatever, and then the aura will produce the extra mana. And the same is true for any of the other mana doublers that were in the previous video. If the land produces more because of Mana Reflection or Nyxbloom Ancient, then Dampening Sphere would hurt those. But if it's from like a Zendikar Resurgent or a Vernal Bloom or any of these auras, then Dampening Sphere does not stop that. So that's an interaction that you might occasionally run into that is worth knowing. So next we're going to go to the 2 mana that tap for 1 additional mana, or give you 1 additional mana. Wolfwillow Haven, which is 2 mana, 1 of which is green. Enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional green. And also for 5 mana, including a single green, sacrifice it, create a 2/2 green wolf creature token, and you can only activate that during your turn. You can do it at instant speed, but it has to be during your turn. And then Fertile Ground, which is 2 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 1 mana of any color. So Fertile Ground gives you the versatility of giving you any color, so you got color fixing. Wolfwillow Haven only gives you green, so that will occasionally matter. You might prioritize that, but even if you're in 2 or 3 colors, after a certain, after 3 or 4 turns into the game, you should usually have access to all your different colors. So most of the mana that you tap is just paying for generic mana costs. So yeah, I don't prioritize mana fixing nearly as high as I'm sure many of you would. But the extra ability on Wolfwillow Haven is something that I do just want to point out, because it's something that there might be an occasion. It's not a good value, because you're paying 2 for the aura, and then you'd have to pay 5 and sacrifice it in order to get a 2/2 wolf token, which isn't good. But there might be occasions where someone does like an enchantment board wipe, and you just happen to have all this mana open because you just didn't have anything else to do, so you could activate it, although you have to do it during your own turn. So yeah, even then it's hard to ever get use out of this, because if you could do it in response to a board wipe, or in response to it being strip mined or whatever, then you can at least get that value out of it from being destroyed. But only if they do the board wipe or the whatever else during your turn. I guess if they happen to Cyclonic Rift you during your turn, you might choose to do that, but that would be dumb, because then you'd lose the wolf. You'll almost never find a scenario in which you'd want to use that ability. But if it ever comes up, it's easy to overlook it, because you're never going to be consciously thinking about it. So next we're going to go to the 3 mana ones that will give you that will still only give you 1 additional mana. So Gift of Paradise, 3 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. When Gift of Paradise enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. Enchanted land has, quote, tap, add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. Sheltered Aerie, 3 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. Enchanted land has, quote, tap, add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. New Horizons, 3 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. When New Horizons enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. Enchanted land has, quote, tap, add 2 mana of any 1 color. And then Weirding Wood, 3 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. When Weirding Wood enters the battlefield, investigate. Enchanted land has, quote, tap, add 2 mana of any 1 color to your mana pool. So these 3 of them have an additional benefit. One gains you a little bit of life, one has a 1/1 counter, and one gives you a clue token. The other one, Sheltered Aerie, it's got nicer art, but it doesn't have any extra actual text. It's the prettiest. But of these 4, they all have the same effect of giving the land the ability to tap to add 2 mana. So it's not 2 additional mana, it's just 2 total, so 1 more than it would presumably normally make. If you happen to attach this to something like a, Temple of the False God, or Ancient Tomb, or Lotus Field, or Lotus Vale, or anything like that, these aren't adding to it. Those already tap for 2 or more mana anyway, so this won't help you. Now, if you happen to have a land that doesn't naturally tap for mana at all, which there are some, then these will ramp you by 2 by allowing that land to tap for mana. Not usually a great strategy, not something that you'd really want to build around, but if for some reason you want your deck to have a bunch of, or at least several, lands that do that, several utility lands that don't even add mana, then these are a way to kind of hedge your bets a little bit so that you can possibly get mana off of those. Overall, these aren't very good. And the thing that I really want to point out and emphasize is they give the land, quote, tap, add 2 mana of any one color, which is exactly what I was talking about a moment ago with the Wild Growth, is that if the land taps for 2 or more mana, then it is going to combo with Mana Reflection and Nyxbloom Ancient. However, it can also be hit by the Dampening Sphere, so risk reward if you're also playing Mana Reflection and Nyxbloom Ancient, these ones will be better than the other auras that just the enchantment itself adds mana. But there's just know the interaction. That's all I can say. And then the last one on this page is Verdant Haven, 3 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. When Verdant Haven enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds 1 mana of any color to his or her mana pool. And then it has a little bit of text that tells you in addition to whatever the land itself would have produced. So again, this one just gives you 1 extra mana. I don't think that that's a great value for a 3 mana card. The gaining 2 life when it enters isn't really fantastic. And yeah, the color fixing, I really don't like this way of going about color fixing. I'd rather just use Cultivates and Kodama's Reaches and stuff like that to get more lands into play, personally. So the next few are actually a little bit better because these ones will add 2 additional mana. So they're definitely more worthwhile. And obviously if you're doing something like an Estrid or Untap effect, then these ones will be a lot better and much more get your money's worth. Dawn's Reflection, 4 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional 2 mana in any combination of colors. Overgrowth, 3 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds an additional double green. And then Market Festival, 4 mana, including a single green. Enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds 2 mana in any combination of colors to his or her mana pool. And that one again has the reminder text telling you that's in addition to whatever the land produces. So personally, I think Overgrowth is the best one of these 3 just because it costs 1 less mana. I know that in a mono green deck, they're all just going to produce green, so the Overgrowth is just strictly better in that sense. But even in a multicolored deck, the color fixing, again, it has some value, but once you get to a point where you already have all your colors in play, then most of the mana you use to cast spells is just going to go towards the generic mana cost of it, and color fixing doesn't really matter after a certain point. Now, one thing I do want to point out is because these are 4 mana spells and they ramp you by 2, they should be most directly compared to an Explosive Vegetation or similar effect. The difference between these and an Explosive Vegetation is that the Explosive Vegetation gives you 2 cards out of your deck, so it's card advantage and deck thinning, which is very important. Also, it spreads out the number of lands that you have. So if for some reason you only needed so much mana, you could only tap like 1 or 2 of those lands and the third one would be untapped. Whereas with this one, the one land, it's either tapped or untapped. You can't just partially tap it to get 1 out of it and leave it 2/3 untapped. So that can occasionally be a little bit of a downside. But the main thing that I think is also a benefit for like a Explosive Vegetation effect is the lands you get are going to be less vulnerable to a strip mine. A single strip mine will kill the land, it'll kill whatever that these are attached to, which means that these also go to the graveyard, which means that it costs you 3 mana. Whereas an Explosive Vegetation just gets you 3 lands, and if they strip mine one of them, you're down 1 mana. So that's one more reason why it's important to go with those effects over these unless you are in an enchantment-based deck or you're doing a lot of untapped stuff. Another thing that I do want to point out with the Stronghold version of Overgrowth is it has the same kind of problem that Wild Growth had, where the writing on this one, we'll just read it real quick. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, it produces an additional double green. That makes it sound like the land is producing the extra mana, which I've made this mistake myself because I read the card. What it says on the card is that the land produces the extra mana, which would combo with mana reflection. So I thought I was giving myself 6 mana instead of 4. Because the way it is written, the way that the other versions of this card show is that the enchantment gives you the 2 mana. So with a mana reflection in play, the land would tap for 2, and then you would add 2 more from this. So you'd only get 4 instead of 6. And that's just something else to be on the lookout for, to make sure that you're not misplaying this or that you don't see anyone else misplay it. But I do hate that one of the original versions of this card says it one way and then they kind of changed it and took it in a worse direction. Pretty unfortunate, but that happens. And then the final thing is it doesn't really fit into the rest of what everything else is doing here. So it's Urban Burgeoning. It costs a single green, and it says enchant land. Enchanted land has, quote, untap this land during each other player's untap step. So this one doesn't even technically kind of ramp you in a way, sort of, but it does, kind of. So if you're playing out of instance and everything, then this can help you to untap it during each of your opponent's turns so that you can keep doing stuff during each turn. If you have, the only other benefit I could think to it is if you have something that is a bit of a mana sink. For example, suppose you had 9 total lands, and one of them was enchanted with this. And then you had one of those creatures that say, like, pay 3 mana, make a 1/1 insect token. Well, what you could do is tap 2 of your lands, plus the one that this is enchanted to, on your turn, then 2 lands in this one on your one opponent's turn, then 2 in this, and then 2 in this, and you, over the course of one turn cycle, on each of those 4 people's turns, you will have generated 4 tokens, because you will have tapped the other 8 lands once each, and you will have tapped this land 4 times. So 12 mana, you got 4 activations. Without this in play, you would have 9 lands, 9 mana, you'd only be able to generate 3 tokens. So that's a very narrow reason to want to play it for that reason. But if you do have a deck that has a lot of, mana sinks into it, and other effects that say untap your lands, like even a Sword of Feast and Famine, deal damage to somebody, untap all your lands. There's that wilderness. These are things that we'll get to on another video, but things that are untapping your lands at different points, then you can, even a Seedborn Muse, then you can actually get your value out of your deck that way. But I think you would need your deck to already be heavily going in that direction for this card to do anything or to perform really at all. So that is it for this video. Definitely on the shorter end, which is nice because they've all gotten very long. And I will be back soon with the video 7. Thank you.